My name is Samantha, and at 34, I never thought I'd be sitting in a high-rise law office in Napa Valley, watching my own parents announce with the biggest smiles on their faces that this $31 million Silverleaf estate was going straight to my younger brother Tyler. They didn't even try to hide it. My dad, Thomas, leaned back in his chair and said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "The Silverleaf estate will belong to your younger brother." Mom nodded, patting Tyler's arm like he'd just won the lottery. Tyler didn't even look up from his phone. He was checking his watch board as if inheriting a legacy was an inconvenience. I felt the air leave my lungs. That estate wasn't just property. It was every harvest of my childhood, every promise my grandmother ever made me. And now they were handing it over like it was nothing. Tyler smirked. My parents looked like they'd already won. Then the family lawyer, Robert, cleared his throat. He looked my father dead in the eye, adjusted his glasses, and said in a voice that cut through the room like a pruning shears, "Mrs. Dorothy's will cannot be changed, sir." The color drained from my parents' faces so fast I thought they might pass out. The smirk vanished from Tyler's face. In that silence, I realized the game had changed. They thought they were the wind blowing wherever they pleased. They didn't know I was the rock. If you're watching this, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Smash that like button and subscribe right now, because you need to hear how my grandmother outsmarted every single one of them from beyond the grave. I grew up in the dirt of the Napa Valley, less than an hour north of San Francisco, but a world away in spirit. While my parents Thomas and Monica were busy climbing the social ladders of the city, attending galas and networking events, I was being raised by my grandmother Dorothy on the Silverleaf estate. Most days after school, it was just me and the vines. Dorothy lived on the estate year-round. Every harvest season the second school let out, I'd be there with her. No parents, no little brother, yet just Grandma and me in the sprawling main house overlooking acres of Cabernet Sauvignon grapes. That house was magic. The smell of crushed grapes and damp earth never left your skin. We'd wake up early before the sun crested the hills to check the dew on the leaves. Dorothy taught me that you can't fake the harvest. The vines don't care about your bank account or your social status. They only care about the work you put into the soil. In the afternoons, she taught me how to read the sugar content of a grape just by tasting it and how to manage the ledger while the sun burned the fog off the valley floor. At night, we sat on the veranda, watching the moon rise over the rose, her arm around me. More than once, she pulled me close, pointed at the vines, and said exactly the same words every time. "This land will always be yours, Samantha. I'm building everything for you." I believed her with every piece of me. She wasn't just saying it. She showed it. She taught me the chemistry of fermentation when I was 12, took me to distribution meetings in San Francisco before I could drive, and told anyone who would listen that I was the future of Silverleaf. Grandma had started with nothing, widowed young, one small plot of land in the 70s that she expanded into a legendary empire. She never remarried, never slowed down, and she made sure I knew every step of the journey. Those summers weren't vacations. They were training. Back in the city the rest of the year, Mom and Dad were distant. Weekends were for golf tournaments and client dinners. But Grandma was the one who flew in for my school plays, the one who sat with me when I cried over my first failure, the one who told me I was capable of running the world if I wanted to. Looking back, those years at Silverleaf were the only time I truly felt like I belonged somewhere. The estate wasn't just a vineyard. It was proof that somebody had chosen me completely. Everything started cracking right after I left for college. I was 19, studying viticulture at UC Davis so I could stay close to the valley when Grandma Dorothy's health began to decline. That was when my parents changed. Dad quit his job in the city without warning. Mom put our San Francisco house on the market the same week. They told me over a quick video call that they were moving the whole family to Napa to help Grandma manage everything in her older years. Tyler, my younger brother, who was only 11 at the time, was thrilled about living on a big estate with a pool. I remember feeling uneasy, but I brushed it off. After all, they were her only daughter and son-in-law. It made sense they'd want to be closer. But the shift was immediate. They didn't come to farm. They came to conquer. Within a year, they had convinced Dorothy to let them move into the main house so they could be there if she needed anything. They pushed me out to the small caretaker's cottage on the edge of the property. The staff Grandma had trusted for decades began disappearing, replaced by people Mom hired because they looked the part. The old cellar master was fired. The gardener who knew every vine by name retired unexpectedly. Phone calls grew shorter. When I tried to reach Grandma directly, Mom would answer and say she was resting. My weekend visits somehow always coincided with last-minute family obligations that didn't include me. I confronted Dad once during a rare dinner. I asked why I was being kept at arm's length. He laughed it off, told me I was being dramatic, said Grandma simply preferred having her daughter nearby now that she was getting older. Looking back, I realize I was trapped in a cycle of normalized cruelty. When you grow up in a drought, you learn to survive on very little water. I accepted the scraps they threw me because I thought it was the price of admission to stay near the legacy. I thought if I just worked harder, if I just proved myself enough, they would finally see me. I didn't know then that they saw me perfectly clearly. They just didn't like what they saw, a threat to their control. By the time I graduated, visits were down to major holidays. And even then I felt like a guest in the home I was raised in. The woman who once flew across the country for my graduation now had her calendar completely managed by Mom. My direct line to the main house rang once and then went straight to voicemail forever. My parents in full control, Tyler treated like the golden child, and me slowly, deliberately pushed out of the picture. I conditioned myself to survive the silence, waiting for the rain that I hoped would eventually come. 3 weeks ago, Grandma Dorothy passed away at 83 in her sleep, right there in the master bedroom, overlooking the vines she planted 50 years ago. The news hit me like a frost in late spring, sudden, biting, and devastating. I drove up to Napa immediately, but the funeral was already being planned by my parents without a single call to ask what I thought. They turned it into a networking event, the kind of spectacle that made headlines in the local wine journals, a celebrity officiant, a string quartet playing Vivaldi White Orchids, flown in from Hawaii, covering every surface of the tasting room. 200 guests, including distributors, investors, and local politicians, all dressed in designer black under crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes. The service felt like a product launch more than a goodbye. Mom stood at the podium in a tailored suit, her voice cracking just enough to draw sympathetic murmurs from the crowd as she spoke about Grandma's unwavering devotion to family. Dad flanked her, nodding solemnly, his hand on her shoulder like they were the picture of grief. Tyler sat in the front row with them, head bowed, looking every bit the devoted grandson. I arrived late because I had to handle an emergency at the bottling plant, and when I slipped into the back, they had saved me a seat in the third row behind a cluster of investors I barely recognized. No usher guided me forward. No one moved to make space. During the eulogy, Mom glanced my way once, her eyes lingering just long enough to make sure I noticed where I was sitting. Then she turned back to the microphone and said how Grandma had sacrificed so much for her children and grandchildren, always putting family first, even when it meant tough choices. The words twisted in my gut. I wanted to stand up and shout that the woman they were describing had been the one constant in my life, not some prop for their narrative. Afterward, at the reception in the Grand Barrel Room, my parents worked the crowd like hosts at a gala. Dad shook hands with executives from competing vineyards, talking about continuing the legacy while sipping a vintage Cabernet from a crystal tumbler. Mom circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres, pulling aunts and uncles into corners to whisper. I caught snippets as I tried to pay respects to old family friends. Samantha's been so busy with her career, Mom said to Aunt Lydia, loud enough for me to hear across the table. She hasn't been around much these last few years. You know how it is with young people. Later, I watched Tyler. He spent the whole time on his phone, snapping selfies with the floral arrangements and posting stories about honoring Grandma's memory. He was hungover, wearing sunglasses indoors, complaining loudly to a college buddy about the heat and how long the service was taking. When I approached him to say how sorry I was, he barely looked up, muttered something about needing to check his crypto wallet, and walked off. It hit me then, the sheer blinding injustice of it. Why him? Why did they choose the lazy, incompetent son over the daughter who knew the soil pH of every acre? It wasn't just sexism. It was narcissism. My parents preferred Tyler because he was an empty vessel. He had no passion, no drive, no identity of his own. That made him easy to control. He was a mirror they could shine their own egos in. I, on the other hand, had my own mind, my own skills, my own love for the land. My competence threatened them. My independence insulted them. They didn't want a successor. They wanted a puppet. The only bright spot was a quiet moment with the old cellar master, Elias. He found me by the fermentation tanks, slipped a small envelope into my hand, and whispered that Grandma had left specific instructions for him to deliver it only if I came. Inside was a handwritten note from Robert the lawyer on heavy cream stationery. Please come to the reading. It's critical. No explanation, just those 4 words and the date, time, and address of his office. Elias squeezed my arm and said Grandma had made him promise to tell me she was proud no matter what happened next. 10 days later, I walked into that conference room feeling like I was stepping into a trap. The space was all polished marble and leather, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the valley. Around the long oak table sat about a dozen people, executives, distant relatives, Aunt Lydia looking uncomfortable in the corner, and of course my parents and Tyler at the head like they owned the place. Dad had his arm around Mom's chair. Tyler sprawled back with his feet almost on the table. They didn't even acknowledge me when I entered. I took the empty seat at the far end, nodding to Elias, who had come as a witness. The air hummed with tension, the kind that builds before a storm. Mom kept glancing at her watch. Dad drummed his fingers on the armrest. Tyler cracked a joke about the wine selection that made the executives chuckle nervously. I stayed silent, folding my hands in my lap, the note from Robert burning a hole in my pocket. Whatever was coming, I knew it wouldn't be good. But I also knew one thing they didn't: I wasn't just the girl in the third row anymore. 4 years ago, I got a text from Grandma Dorothy's private number, the one only 3 people in the world had. She never used it unless something was critical. She told me to meet her in the old underground reserve cellar at midnight and to tell no one, especially not my parents. I arrived at 11:55. The cellar was cool and smelled of damp earth and ancient oak, a scent that always grounded me. It was the one place on the estate my parents refused to visit because they thought it was dirty and claustrophobic. To them, wine was something you drank in a crystal glass. The process of making it was beneath them. Grandma was already there, sitting on a crate next to a barrel of the 1982 vintage, a single lantern illuminating the space. She looked thinner than usual, shadows clinging to her face, but her eyes were sharp as flint. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She locked the heavy iron door behind me and slid a thick bound report across the barrel. For the past decade, she had kept everything in a revocable living trust so she could change it whenever she wanted. To make life easier, she had named Dad co-trustee years earlier, giving him full access to accounts and signature authority in case anything happened to her. It was supposed to be a safety net. It had become a pipeline. Grandma had hired an outside forensic accountant after noticing inventory numbers that didn't add up. The report showed that over the previous 3 years, my parents had quietly transferred $56,400,000 into renovation shell companies they controlled. They were billing the estate for repairs that never happened, equipment that was never bought, and marketing campaigns that didn't exist. Everything was technically legal because the trust was still revocable, and Dad had signing power. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "I trusted your father too much once. Never again." That same week, she had contacted Robert, the attorney who had handled her contracts since the 80s. They met in complete secret. Robert drafted a new legal entity, the Reserve Trust. It was an irrevocable trust that could not be changed or revoked by anyone ever. On a single day, while my parents thought she was at a cardiologist appointment, Grandma signed papers transferring the land title to the entire 300-acre estate, the Silverleaf trademark rights, and $96 million in liquid assets into this new trust. I was named the sole beneficiary and sole trustee. The moment the documents were notarized, those assets legally left her estate forever. Dad's co-trustee power no longer reached them. She pushed the final page toward me, her hand shaking only slightly. "This is yours now, Samantha. They will never see it coming." I looked at the papers, realizing she was handing me the kingdom while my parents were busy measuring the drapes in the castle. "Promise me you will say nothing. Not a word. Not a hint. Until the day my regular will is read." She knew my parents would fight, scream, maybe even try to have her declared incompetent if they found out while she was alive. But an irrevocable trust executed while she was clearly lucid was ironclad under California law. They could rage all they wanted later. They would never touch it. "Let them think they are in charge," she whispered, gripping my hand. "Let them play CEO. Let them think you are beaten. Play weak when you are strongest." I signed the papers on top of a wine barrel, the rough wood pressing into my skin. That night I didn't just inherit a vineyard, I inherited a war. I drove back to my cottage with the weight of the biggest secret I would ever keep. For the next 4 years, I acted like nothing had changed. I let Mom intercept my calls. I let Dad lecture me on business. I watched Tyler drive cars bought with stolen money. Every time I wanted to scream, I remembered the cool air of the cellar and Grandma's voice telling me to wait. I wasn't weak. I was fermenting. The silence in the room didn't last long. It shattered the moment the reality of Robert's words hit my father's ego. Dad stood up, his face flushing a deep, dangerous red, and slammed his hand onto the mahogany table. He shouted that it was impossible, that the irrevocable trust was a forgery, that Grandma was senile, that he would drag this through every court in California until he got what was his. Mom joined in, her voice shrill, claiming they had rights as the primary caregivers, that they had sacrificed their lives to manage the estate. Robert didn't even blink. He waited for them to run out of breath, his expression bored like a teacher waiting for a toddler's tantrum to end. When they finally quieted down, panting with rage, Robert slid a second document across the table. He explained that they needed to read the fine print. Under the terms of the original will, they did indeed inherit 100% of Silverleaf Management Limited Liability Company. Tyler let out a loud, relief-filled laugh, throwing his hands up as if he'd scored a touchdown. He smirked at me and said he knew Grandma wouldn't leave them with nothing. But Robert held up a hand. He clarified that Silverleaf Management was the operating entity. It employed the staff, paid the utility bills, and managed the daily logistics. However, it owned absolutely nothing. It did not own the land. It did not own the vines. It did not own the production equipment, the barrels, the inventory, or even the trademarked name Silverleaf. All of those assets, the soul and the value of the estate, were property of the Reserve Trust. For the past 4 years, the operating company had been leasing the land and the brand from the trust. And Robert added, with a cold smile, that lease agreement expired yesterday. He opened a financial statement and pushed it toward my father. The operating company my parents and Tyler had just inherited had 0 assets and $12 million in operational debt created by their own embezzlement and mismanagement. They hadn't inherited an empire. They had inherited a hollow shell and a mountain of bills. My father slowly sat back down, deflating like a punctured tire. He looked at the papers, then at me, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. Mom tried a different tactic. She reached across the table, her eyes filling with those practiced manipulative tears. She said they did this for the family, that they were just trying to modernize the brand, that surely I wouldn't let my own brother go bankrupt. That was the moment I finally spoke. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I used the voice I used when negotiating bottle prices with distributors, cold, flat, and final. I told them that, as the sole trustee, I had decided not to renew the operating lease with their company. I was taking operations in-house. And as for the main house they were living in, that was also property of the trust. I pulled a single sheet of paper from my own folder and slid it across the polished wood. It was a 30-day notice to vacate. I told them their lease on the residence had been terminated, effective immediately. They had 1 month to remove their personal effects. Tyler looked up from his phone, his face pale. He stammered that he had ordered a Ferrari yesterday, that he had put down a non-refundable deposit based on the inheritance. I looked him dead in the eye and told him he should probably cancel it, because unless he could pay for it with $12 million of debt, he was walking home. If my parents thought losing the estate was the worst of it, they were wrong. The silence in the room was thick enough to choke on, broken only by the sound of Tyler hyperventilating quietly in his chair. Dad was staring at the eviction notice like it was a death warrant. Mom was muttering something about where they would go, how they would explain this to their friends at the club. But Robert wasn't finished. He closed the first folder and opened a second, smaller one. This one wasn't leather, it was plain red cardstock. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. He said there was one more matter to discuss, the pre-sale. My father's head snapped up so fast I heard his neck crack. The color, which had been slowly returning to his face, vanished completely. Robert explained that during the forensic audit of the operating company they had found some interesting correspondence. Specifically, a contract signed 3 weeks ago by Thomas and Monica with a developer known for buying distressed properties and turning them into strip malls. Desperate to cover their mounting gambling debts and failed investments before Grandma even died, my parents had secretly sold the Silverleaf estate. They had signed a binding agreement to transfer the title to the developer the moment probate closed for a fire sale price of $40 million. In exchange for this bargain, the developer had wired them a non-refundable deposit of $5 million, money they had already spent on paying off loan sharks and booking a luxury cruise. The problem, Robert explained with a predatory smile, was that you cannot sell what you do not own. Since the title had been transferred to the Reserve Trust 4 years ago, my parents had committed fraud. They had signed a contract guaranteeing the sale of property that wasn't theirs. That $5 million wasn't a deposit anymore. It was evidence of grand larceny. Mom let out a strangled sob. Dad looked at the door like he was measuring the distance to run. Robert checked his watch and said casually that the developer was not a man known for his patience. In fact, his legal team and potentially the authorities were currently waiting in the lobby to discuss the immediate return of their $5 million. Since the operating company had no assets to repay it, my parents would be personally liable. And given the amount, this wasn't a civil dispute. It was a criminal matter. I watched them crumble. The arrogance, the entitlement, the years of looking down on me, it all evaporated, leaving only fear. They weren't just broke, they were facing prison. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. I told them I had a harvest to manage and didn't have time for criminals. As I walked out, I heard the heavy oak doors open in the lobby and the sound of men's voices asking for Thomas and Monica. I didn't look back. The eviction happened 3 days later, and it was a public spectacle. Security teams hired by me arrived at the estate at dawn. They didn't knock, they unlocked the gates. It was a humiliation conga line. My mother tried to leave with the family silver, screaming that it was her birthright, until security stopped her at the door and reminded her that the inventory list was part of the trust. Tyler tried to drive off in the company SUV, claiming it was his only to watch it get towed because the lease was in the company's name, a company that was now bankrupt. I stood on the balcony of the main house, the same spot where Grandma used to hold me and point at the horizon. I watched them leave my parents in a taxi because their personal cars had been seized by creditors, Tyler walking down the long driveway with a single suitcase, looking back as if expecting me to change my mind. I didn't look down. I looked out at the vines. The old cellar master, Elias, came out and stood next to me. He didn't say anything, he just nodded. The parasites were gone. The roots could finally breathe. 1 year later, it is harvest time. The air is thick with the scent of crushed grapes and yeast. The Silverleaf estate is thriving under my management. We've cut the cheap blends, restored the original labels, and the new vintage named the Matriarch in honor of Dorothy is already sold out on pre-order. I learned later what happened to them. Dad and Mom are currently out on bail, awaiting trial for fraud and grand larceny. They live in a small rental apartment in a strip mall complex, the kind with beige carpets and thin walls. Mom tells anyone who will listen that she was robbed by her ungrateful daughter. Dad spends his days trying to find new investors for schemes that no longer exist. Tyler is working manual labor at a warehouse to pay off his gambling debts. The irony isn't lost on me. He finally has to work for a living. I sit in the vineyard as the sun sets, a glass of the 1982 vintage in my hand. I think about Grandma's lesson in the cellar. Real love doesn't shout. It plants seeds and waits. My actions weren't revenge. They were gardening. You cannot grow good fruit if you don't prune the dead wood. I didn't destroy my family. I protected the garden from the weeds so the legacy could survive. Real love doesn't shout. It plants seeds and waits. If you've ever had to prune the toxic people out of your life to let your own garden grow, drop A in the comments. I read every single one. Take care of your peace.